recommendations for FY11.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Bob Samario, Assistant Finance Director. I'm so sorry. We have two items, and the first item will be the arts funding. And I'm going to turn over to Sue Gray, Administrative Services Manager, to at least introduce the item.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, Finance Committee members, today we're here to present the funding recommendations of the City Arts Advisory Committee for fiscal year 2011. The city's fiscal year 2011 budget appropriated $427,260 for city arts programs, and that's broken down into 5 different categories. $132,047 for coordination and administration of the program, $7,901 for continued development of the downtown cultural district, $100,000 for community events and festivals grants, $141,763 for organizational development grants, and $45,549 for community arts grants. The recommended grant awards that you're going to be reviewing today total $291,812. Those are the last 3 that I mentioned, the community art events and festivals, organizational development, and community arts grants. It consists of the funding that was appropriated for fiscal year 11 plus $4,500 of fiscal year 2010 unspent grants. So they had a little extra to allocate on those categories. And today we have here Ginny Brush. She's the Executive Director of the County Arts Commission, and she's going to make a presentation.
Hi, Ginny.
Hi. Chair Williams and members of the committee, I just wanted to give you, if you're not familiar with a little bit of background, the Arts Commission, the City of Santa Barbara contracts with the County Arts Commission to provide its art services. This is something that we take very seriously. It's a delightful part of what we do during the course of the year is to work with the various cultural arts organizations. We usually start in March this process by announcing the awards and held a number of technical support workshops to give guidance and advice to those people that have applied before or are new to the system and are interested in finding out more about that. So we provide technical support for the grants process. One of the things that we've done over the last several years is initiate a process by which first-time applicants or even second-time applicants, if they would like to submit a draft of their grant for input from staff, they've been able to do so, and we get good feedback that that's resulted in better results for them, and certainly I think it's a way to provide better guidance so that they end up with a better and more well-written grant. So this year, the City Arts Advisory and the Events and Festivals Committee held their meetings and reviewed the grants. I want to especially acknowledge the volunteer efforts of these people that serve on these committees that go home with a stack full of grants to read through very thoroughly, and they take their job very seriously and put a lot of time and energy and thoughtfulness into their grant awards. So what you're looking at today represents those recommended committee recommendations to City Arts Advisory. City Arts Advisory and the Events and Festivals Committee are making these recommendations to you today. And in terms of, as you know, over the last several years, we've had budget cuts last year and the year before. So the funding totals we're looking at are down about 20% from what they were 3 years ago. And so if you start looking at totals of past funding history and you see what people requested and what they got this year, that was quite a shock with the committee members to realize that we have some very significant and important cultural arts organizations, and our ability to fund them has certainly been diminished as a result of the committee. But I also want to acknowledge some bright spots that the Arts and Cultural Center and the Granada Theater have been great in promoting more synergy among the arts community and continue. I applaud the arts community in continuing to collaborate, share resources, do everything they can to take advantage of social networking and other technology to become leaner and meaner than they have in the past. So just as for the specifics, I just wanted to As Sue said, that in the area of community arts grants, these are grants that usually fund smaller arts organizations or artist-based organizations and community-based events. There was a total funding amount of $45,549. We totaled for the 23, there were 23 nonprofit organizations that applied, and their funding request totaled $132,640. So you can see there's quite a gap between what was requested and what was available to award. In the area of organizational development, these are the more established arts organizations, and as we anticipated, we had a greater number of applicants this year than we have in past years. Some of these larger organizations that had been applying in events and festivals grant application category moved over here because they really were looking at more for just ongoing support for their programming. So in this category, there were 34 nonprofit organizations applying with funding requests totaling $486,833, of which we only had $143,263 to award. And then in the area of community events and festivals, we had $103,000 to award, and we had funding requests from 12 organizations totaling $254,154. I am pleased to say that of everyone that applied this year, all were awarded some sort of funding. And I am here to answer any questions that you might have about the recommendations.
Do you have any questions from the committee members?
Yes, I do.
Councilmember Sell.
Thank you, Mrs. Bush. Do you know what the decline in funding this year was, not counting the carryover from last year?
It was 12, I want to say 12% or 12.8%. 12 even. 12, and I think it was approximately 8% the previous year.
Okay. And where you have events and festivals, is Solstice and Fiesta, are they funded some other way by the city? Because they do receive funds also,
Yes,
right?
they're not included in these grant requests.
So,
The really big ones, such as Solstice or the Film Festival, are line items on our budget. And you looked at that in the fiscal year 10-11 budget.
yeah, I did. I guess I did. Okay, thank you.
Any questions? And you were asking for a recommendation to council for this today.
Absolutely.
Well, I just want to tell you that I know it is very difficult in with declining budgets and rising requests for this committee to make the determinations that they make, and I know they're very thoughtful in that determination, and they continue to be open to new programs too, which is even more difficult. You know, when you have worthwhile programs that are existing and you have less money, it's even more difficult to be open to new ideas and new programs. So I think they do a very good job of balancing that, and I really appreciate you for helping them in that capacity. Can I get a recommendation from the committee?
I move that we forward this funding request to the full council.
Is there a second?
I second that.
All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Opposed? It's unanimous. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
For them. Okay.
Okay. Ready, Rudy? The fate of the city is in your hands. Here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. So we have really two parts to this presentation. The first is, and you'll see in your agenda report, that we have attached the interim financial statements, which are actually go all the way through the end of the year, fiscal year 2010. And as you know, we bring to you monthly and then quarterly a report on how we're doing year to date in terms of actual results versus the budget. And of course, this is now the final end of the year. We didn't plan on presenting or getting into the discussion of what's in the attachment to the agenda report. Those are the interims. And we're here really to answer questions on that portion of it. The interim financial statements go through what we call period 12. They don't include any adjustments that we make at the end of the year. We don't make them during the year, but at the end of the year, as we prepare for the financial audit and to prepare our financial statements, we do a number of adjustments at the end of the year to accrue revenues, for example, to record depreciation and things of that nature. Those are not reflected in the interim financial statements. They're really just a way to show you how we're doing sort of from a budget to actual perspective. When we make those adjustments at the end of the year, it's no longer appropriate to compare it to budget because things like depreciation, we don't budget, things we capitalize expenditures. So, again, we're not looking to get into a discussion of the interims. We will be presenting to you in November or December our financial statements, our CAFR, and at that point we'll show you the final results for all funds, including all those year-end adjustments, so we can see, on a real economic basis, particularly in enterprise funds, how we did in 2010. So today what we wanted to focus on was just the general fund and give you at least a preliminary look. It's pretty close to being final, but a preliminary look at how we ended the year, both in revenues and expenditures. And both Rudy and Jill have a part in this, but I just wanted to start with just some background in sort of how we kind of started the year and how we ended the year. So just to give you for some context and perspective to their presentations. So I just want to reiterate that the numbers that are in the attached interims are going to be different than what we're going to be presenting today because of these year-end adjustments that we've made. So just kind of by way of background, you might remember that in June of 2009, we adopted the fiscal year 2010 budget. However, 2 weeks prior to that, we received sales tax information that indicated that we are already out of balance even before our budget was effective on July 1. We saw that was sort of the first big number or big decline in sales tax for that quarter ended March 31st, which is the third quarter of the fiscal year. And so in November, we saw additional deterioration in revenues, not just sales tax, but bed tax and property taxes. And we came in with a sort of a new balancing strategy, which indicated that we needed to reduce our revenues by about $2.9 million. But then we implemented some strategies, including one-time funds, such as our workers' comp premium rebate. We capitalized on position vacancies that totaled about $1.6 million. And we actually lowered the departmental budget. But we, in effect, rebalanced in November for the $2.9 million shortfall in revenues we were projecting even at that point. And that's just between July 1 and November. Things got worse from that point on. In March, we came back to you to indicate that we had additional revenue shortfalls we were projecting of $2.3 million on top of the $2.9 we presented in November. And as part of that, we had a special work session with council, and we talked about some strategies and some measures that we could use. Some of those measures included relying on additional projected departmental savings. We had additional vacancies that we were going to not capitalize on, but rely on for the year. We did use additional workers' comp rebates. We did shift, you might recall, some franchise fees from the solid waste fund to the general fund, and we had other measures. But we really didn't rebalance in a sense in that we didn't adjust the budget for all these items. We just anticipated that if we were able to capitalize on these savings or realize some of these savings, that we would end the year probably somewhere in the order of $200,000, still short. But we thought it was too early to tell. We were going to wait and see how we actually ended the year. The revenues could come in better, but we were effectively pretty balanced with the measures that we identified. So today we're here to tell you that we know what the final numbers are. There's going to be one or two minor adjustments. One of them is waiting for the final sales tax data that we'll be getting in a few days, really. We'll know what that number is. But for the most part, the numbers are final, at least in the general fund. And we are estimating now that we're going to end the year with a surplus of over $800,000. And that's really good news, and we'll talk more about that. But it just means that our revenues did a little better than we thought they would between March and June 30, and our expenditures did better, meaning that departments did a better job of holding back costs and realizing savings primarily from vacant positions. So it's really good news. But again, this is different than what you'll see in the interims, which show, I think, a $300,000 surplus. But this is pretty close to a final number. So again, I think it's really good news, and that will add to, of course, our reserves at the end of the year, which are, of course, under policy right now. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jill Tara, our Treasury Manager, and she'll get into the revenue detail discussion and show how some of the key revenues came in the year.
Good afternoon,
you, Jill.
Jill Tara, Treasury Manager. And as I walk through the preliminary year-end results for the revenues, please feel free to stop me at any time if you have questions. I'd like to start right at the bottom, start at the punchline, which is the total general fund. Now, as Bob mentioned, the amended budget reflects the budget adjustments that Council approved in November, and we came back to you with revised revenue estimates in the spring. So you can see that the amended budget reflected $104.2 million in revenues budgeted for the general fund, and we expect our year-end actual to end at $100.4 million. That represents a $3.7 million shortfall. And again, that was planned because by the spring we counted on that, and Bob mentioned there were a number of measures that we implemented. So in a sense, it's not good news from the amended budget, but we came in pretty much on target from what we revised. Starting with sales tax up at the top, as Bob mentioned, we do not have our actual year-end number for sales tax yet. We expect that in the next couple of days. The amended budget was $17 million for sales tax, and we came in at 16. We expect to come in at $16.5 million, which is a variance of just over $500,000. I'd like to put, Bob, if you could put up the sales tax exhibit, I can show you more clearly what we're looking at for sales tax. As you can see at the far column on the right, the year-end numbers for fiscal year 10, we have received the sales tax results through the March 31st quarter, which is through the third quarter. We're still waiting on the fourth quarter results. Now, we have assumed an estimated 0% growth for the June quarter. And right now, just sticking with our estimates, that puts us about $92,000 over our initial year-end estimate. That could come in better, and as I said, and as Bob mentioned, we'll know that number in a couple of days, and our sales tax will be final. One interesting thing to note is if you look over on the far left, the historical actuals, you have to go back to 1999 to see the sales tax levels that we're expecting at the end of fiscal year 2010. So we've lost many, over a decade of growth in sales tax due to the economic decline or economic recession. If you could go back to the main schedule, great. We'll move on to property tax, the amended budget based on preliminary guidance before we had our final numbers. This was preliminary guidance from the County of Santa Barbara, and we expected a 0.8% growth in the property tax, and Council amended the budget down to the $23.4 million level. As it turns out, our actual property tax came in with a decline of 0.8% at just over $23 million. That's a $386,000 negative variance. And what we saw in our final property tax results were slightly lower property tax receipts on the secured property tax portion on properties and homes, and significant decline in the supplemental. And the supplemental property taxes are assessed to new property owners after they buy a home at a market price higher than at its assessed value on the county property tax roll. And the supplemental property tax for fiscal year 10 was down 44% from fiscal year 9, so we saw a significant decline in that. I'm moving on to TOT. Now you receive monthly updates on the TOT, so I know you're familiar with this. Our year-end actual, we ended the year at just over $11.4 million, which was a positive variance from the amended budget, and that was due to the last few months of the fiscal year coming in significantly better than we had anticipated. We did see a turnaround in the spring in TOT. What also contributed to the results in fiscal year 10 were the vacation rental audit program that Council directed us to conduct this fiscal year to bring in vacation rentals that were operating in the city without a business license and not paying TOT. Through that program, which wrapped up in February, we collected an additional $133,000 in new TOT receipts, brought in 74 new properties enrolled, and that will wrap into our base, although TOT on vacation rentals is highly variable, so it's unknown exactly how much we'll receive next year, but we did bring in 74 new properties. TOT ended the year with a 4.8% decline from the previous fiscal year, which was better than we anticipated when we amended the budget downward in November. Moving on to UUT, which is our utility users tax. We lowered the budget in November down to $6.9 million, and we came in just over $7 million with a slight positive variance of $92,682. That was due entirely to significantly better than expected growth in the telecom sector, particularly in cell phones. And we see just the proliferation of cell phones and bundled packages with internet access and data plans. The telecom sector alone in UUT grew 12.8% from fiscal year 2009. So UUT overall ended the year up 2.3 from the previous fiscal year in 2009. On to franchise fees, you'll see a significant negative variance there of $423,000 from the amended budget. We ended the year at $3.35 million. And that's a large decline, but it was consistent with our year-end estimates, as I mentioned before. And the shortfall was due to declines in the electric and cable sectors, and mostly due to declines in the gas sector. The gas company pays us on in advance each year, and then they true it up in March of the following year. And they had over-advanced us through fiscal year 2009, so the last 4 months of the fiscal year in 2010, we received 0 gas franchise fees. So that really hurt us, and it will continue. I think the next payment we expect to receive once they've trued up the overpayment won't be until October of this year. Business licenses, we're happy to report, came in basically flat from the amended budget, which was also the adopted budget. We hadn't reduced that in November. Came in only slightly below by about $56,000. And the number of licensed businesses in the city declined by only 1%, or 139 businesses between 2009 and 2010, which is good news, and leaves us with 14,570 registered businesses in the city. I'd like to skip down to the interest line item. As you can see, the amended budget reflected a $941,000 budget, and we came in at over $1 million, and that positive variance of $147,000 was due primarily to our interest income on our portfolio outperforming our projections. And during the year, we looked at the declining market and yields plummeting, and we restructured our portfolio in such a way to preserve the principal and ensure the safety of the portfolio, ensure that we had adequate liquidity on hand, but bought into securities with higher yielding front-end coupons, which gave us a nice life alternative and ensured that we outperformed our projections. Skipping down to the anticipated year-end variance, as you know, that's a budgeting tool that we use to balance the general fund, and in traditional years we know that our revenue estimates will come in over budget and expenditures will come in under budget, and that's what we typically see. Now, we knew in this economy that we would not see any revenue surpluses, so we expected that $1.3 million to come entirely from expenditure savings in departments, which it did, and Rudy will go through that in his presentation, but you will never see an actual in that column, even though we budgeted as a revenue. The last item I'd like to cover are the departmental revenues, and in the amended budget contained $28.1 million budget for departmental revenues, and our actual came in at 26.5. So we had a $1.6 million shortfall in departmental revenues, and I'll just walk you through quickly some of the major variances. And Bob's putting up a schedule showing the results by department. You can see that community development had a positive variance of $18,000, so they came in basically flat. This was due to building and safety revenues, primarily building permits, coming in about $170,000 over budget. This offset the shortfall of the payroll reimbursement from the RDA to the general fund for staffing. As you know, the RDA has no staff and contracts with the city's general fund to provide the staffing, and due to vacancies in that program, there were less expenditures, salary expenditures, and therefore less revenues. So community development came in basically flat. As you can see, skipping down to the fire department, there was a large negative variance of $1.477 million, and that's entirely due to lower mutual aid revenues, which I think you're familiar with. The police negative variance of $390,000 was due to a shortfall in parking violation revenues, lower COPS reimbursement, and the JAG grant reimbursement, as well as some other shortfalls and other fees. Public Works came in $579,000 over their revenue budget, due primarily to increased engineering work order revenues, which is for engineering staff time charged to capital projects. The library had a shortfall of roughly $92,000, and this is an interesting and a little misleading number, because the library will use a transfer in of gift funds in order to balance to their general fund subsidy target. And this year, with the expenditure savings that they received or that they realized in the department, that transfer was not needed. So they were able to preserve their gift funds for use in future years. Lastly, Parks and Recreation Department had roughly $246,000 shortfall, and that was in a combination of shortfalls in facility rentals, cultural arts, adults, the active adults program, as well as tennis programs. And if you do have any questions on the departmental revenues, any more specific details you'd like, we do have some staff representatives here who can answer those questions. That concludes my presentation. And
Is there any questions from committee members for Jill on the revenues? Councilmember Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One question I had, and if this is too detailed, don't worry about it right now, but I'm curious about on the vacation rental, the extra TOT that came into that, if we can quantify the cost of the staff effort that went into adding that increment of income.
there was no additional staffing, so it was just absorbed primarily by Brenda Craig, our finance supervisor, our staff, Margarita Sanchez, who coordinated all of it, and Lynn Sparks, our finance analyst, who analyzed it, and myself to review and answer questions and do the public outreach. So there was no additional cost.
Okay.
I'd be hard-pressed to go back and try and figure
That's
out
okay
how
then.
many
No, that's
staff
fine.
hours, but now
So
it's done. and
What you're
so
saying is you just worked harder and got just more done. Okay, very good. That's fine.
Actually, the December furlough helped a lot because basically with the city operations ceasing for those couple of weeks, we were able to focus in on implementing that. So it made it easy. We shifted our furlough to other times.
Okay, good. Do you know what the reason was for the, obviously, the gas company tremendously overestimated demand? Was that mostly due to the economic downturn in general, or what? Do you happen to know about that?
I know that commodity prices dropped significantly from what they were in 2009, and so that or from 2008, and so they based it on 2009. Anyway, it was due primarily to the commodity pricing, and I think lesser to
I see.
extent to reduced usage.
And then you mentioned, I forget what the number was, 134 fewer business licenses, whatever that number was.
Yes.
The decline. Mm-hmm. Was there also a decline in the previous year?
That I didn't look at, but I assume there was.
Okay. All right.
I can get that number for you.
Great. Thank you.
With that, I'll turn it over to Rudy Livingston, Accounting Manager, and he can walk through the expenditure results.
Thank you, Rudy.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, and members of the Finance Committee. As Jill indicated, I am Rudy Livingston, the Accounting Manager, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. We're here to discuss the general fund expenditures and some variances at June 30th. Now, I want to reiterate something that Bob mentioned in his opening comments. The numbers that we're going to be talking about here will not agree to the interim financial statements that are in your packet, because those were done on a basis that did not include the year-end accruals that we need to make as part of our final year-end adjustments, getting ready for our auditors to come and also for our CAFR presentation. So if there are questions on the interim, we'd be more than happy to answer those questions also, but my focus will be on the year-end numbers. And I apologize, I've had a little bit of a cough, so I'm trying to cough out of the microphone. We don't anticipate many changes, but it is possible that there will be some changes as we continue on and the auditors look at things. It's possible that we may find something that needs to be adjusted, but as of right now, this is pretty close to what we're estimating the year-end numbers to be. The schedule that you see up there is general fund expenditures, and I want to make a comment. First of all, the budget column that you see there is the amended budget, which was lowered by about $1.5 million in November. And so these are the lowered numbers that we're comparing to. If you look, we have the budget numbers, we got the actual numbers, and then we have a variance. And then we have this item called a budget carryover. General fund departments, well, typically when we have encumbrances outstanding, those would carry over to the next year. But this year we are not doing that way. Every single item that was recommended for carryover was analyzed, and only those that we felt were necessary to have appropriations go with them were sent over that way. And so some of the encumbrances that were sitting out there, and you'll see the encumbrances in that interim schedule, those did not necessarily get carried over with appropriations into 2011. So we ended up recommending carryovers of approximately $192,000. I want to focus in on a couple of excuse me, a couple of variances that we have. We see that overall the general fund had $3.8 million variance. Approximately $2.2 million of that variance was related to salaries and benefits savings. And on my next slide, I'll talk about those for 4 different departments. And that primarily the largest savings that we have come from community development, fire, parks and recreation, and police. And we'll go to the salaries and benefits. This schedule shows the actual and the budgeted salaries and benefits by department in the general fund. You'll see that overall we were $2,165,000 below our budgeted salaries and benefits. A significant portion of this is related to the hiring freeze that was carried out during the year, and when people left their positions, they weren't filled or they were held vacant for a significant amount of time. The Community Development Department had almost $454,000 of salary and benefit savings, primarily due to a couple of vacancies and some charges that were actually recovered, and the salary expenses were actually paid for by some of the enterprise funds as the staff were doing work for those particular funds, and so that helped to reduce their numbers. The Fire Department was $640,000 under budget, and 100% of that is attributable to the mutual aid incidents. As Jill indicated, we're almost $1.4 million, roughly $1.4 million below our estimated revenues because we just did not get the mutual aid call-outs that we normally have. And the fire department budgeted almost $1.2 million of overtime costs related to mutual aid over what they actually received. And so this variance is fully covered, is attributable to that. Parks and Recreation salaries and benefits were almost $240,000 under their budget, and that is primarily due to positions that were held vacant during the year. And the police department, once again, they also were $447,000 under. They were about 7 officers short for most of the year, and they also had a crime analyst position that was unfilled, and a tech in the crime lab that was not filled. They had a couple of I think it was 4 cadets that graduated from the academy in San Bernardino right before year end, but those 7 vacancies were there for most of the year, and so that this variance is almost totally attributable to that. Other than that, I wasn't planning to discuss any of the other variances in salaries and benefits unless there's one of the committee members has a question on some of those.
Councilmember Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Rudy, just one question back on your first sheet when you were talking about how typically encumbrances would be treated as carryover.
Yes.
And we're not doing that this time. The encumbrances are still there.
That's correct.
So
yeah, the encumbrances are the result of purchase orders that are outstanding at the end of the year. And all of those purchase orders were carried over to fiscal year 11 unless the departments requested that we close out those purchase orders. Even though the purchase order, the encumbrance, the liability we have was carried forward, we did not necessarily carry over budget appropriations to cover that. And so the individual departments will be absorbing any of those costs in their fiscal 11 budgets that were authorized when the budget was adopted.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Rudy, explain this final slide that you have to
Yes, that's
for
where
us.
I'm going right now. This slide is actually a combination of information that Jill presented and also information that I presented. On the left-hand part of this slide, we're talking about our general fund budget, our general fund expenditures, and what the actual variance was for each one of those departments within the general fund. It comes out to the $3.8 million. That is really what, excuse me, I'm thinking 2 thoughts here at the same time, and I don't want to do that. The $3.8 million is what we are adding to our reserves before we take away any variance that we had, a negative variance in the revenues that Jill spoke about. However, we have $192,000 that will be carried over into fiscal year 11, so we actually end up with a $3.6 million positive variance in our expenditures for all of those the general fund departments at year end. One thing I want to mention first before I go any further is if you look at that, all of those numbers in that column are positive, which means that every department within the general fund met their legal spending limits, and they were under those limits, and so we do not have an issue with them being in legal compliance. What we wanted to do was present where they are on a net basis, considering what their departmental revenues, how the departmental revenues did during the year. These numbers are slightly different than Jill's because there are a few things like there's a few taxes and things that are attributable to departments, and these are non-tax departmental revenues. That column, for each one of those departments, most of them you can see are negative, so that means that their departmental revenues came in under what was budgeted. And so we carry that forward and combine those two numbers to get our net reserves consumed, or our net addition to the general fund budget from each one of those departmental operations. So overall, we had almost a $2.1 million increase in reserves attributable to departmental operations. And that's that far right-hand column.
If I could just add something, I'm not sure it's going to help, but the idea is to recognize that while departments may be doing really well on the expenditure side and coming under budget, the other side of the equation within the department is how their revenues did. In some cases, they did equally well, and in some cases, they didn't. And a good example is in the fire department. You saw that, or you can see that on the expenditure side, they look really good because their expenditures were under budget by 9/31. But they also didn't bring in $1.5 million in revenues all related to mutual aid. So on a net basis, they really ended up creating about a $500,000 net deficit to the general fund's reserves. And that's just the whole idea, is to compare both revenue shortfalls or surpluses and expenditure variances to see on a net basis how each department did for the year. It's just something to kind of look at.
And with that, I don't have any prepared comments beyond that, but I would be happy to answer any questions you might have on these schedules or on the interim statements.
Questions from the committee members? Well, I think Councilmember Francisco has one, so.
Thank you. So where do you believe that the general fund fiscal reserve will be when this is over? I mean, I know we don't have the exact amount, but...
Yeah.
That's a good segue into the schedule here that I have.
Okay.
This is just kind of bringing Jill's discussion and revenue analysis along with Rudy's bringing it all together and show what did the sort of in total how we ended the year, at least preliminarily. So the first row is our total revenues. It starts with our adopted budget, and then you can see that it moves into what the changes were in 2010, and those changes reflect not only adjustments made in November when we adjusted the budget to rebalance, but carryovers from 2009 into 2010. Any other amendments made to the budget during the year. So that gets us to our amended budget. And then we have our preliminary actual results, and then our variance, which is either a favorable, a positive number, or unfavorable number. So in our adopted budget, you might recall, it was a balanced budget. That was the whole idea. Even though we knew that going into it that because of the sales tax data, we were kind of behind the curve. But our amended budget, even though it's not really balanced, it does have a surplus of $755,000. And that's because in March, we implemented some measures such as one-time revenues from like the workers' comp fund and also from the solid waste fund, but we didn't implement things such as expected savings that we were going to realize from position vacancies beyond what we capitalized on in November. So the amended budget does reflect a $755,000 surplus, but really not a meaningful number, but it does kind of give you a sense of where we were. And then the preliminary actual just shows you what's the bottom line. Ignoring all the budget numbers, how did we end up the year? Our revenues came in at almost $5 million, and our expenditures $99.6 million, which means that our net surplus that we're projecting for the year is over $800,000, and that's the number that will add to our reserve balances at the end of the year, which beginning number we had last year. So whatever we had last year will be greater by $833,000. Now, I will mention that our available reserves will actually increase slightly beyond that because, as you know, our policy reserves are a function of our operating budget, and typically every year it'll grow, and so our budget will grow, and so will our reserve requirements. But because we're in an unusual time, our budgets are actually shrinking. So we expect that as the end of 2010, our reserve requirements for economic contingencies and budgetary reserves will actually go down, which will free up available reserves. And I don't know what that number is, but it might be in the order of a few $100,000. So in addition to the $800,000, we could see almost in total about $1 million being added to our available reserves, which brings our shortfall to somewhere in the order of $8 million instead of $9 million that we currently had, or we had as of last year. So hopefully that answers your question.
And if we want to translate that into the bottom line is we are ending this fiscal year despite many challenges with a net surplus. Not a huge surplus, but a significant
That's correct.
size.
It's really good news. Because you might recall we were thinking it might be about $200,000 short, but as I mentioned, the revenues did better and our expenditures did even better than that. So good year-end results. So that concludes our report, and be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
No, I think that's enough. And unless there's any other.
So
Okay,
we'll be
adjourn.
taking this to council today,
Great.
this afternoon? and making a more brief report.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Samara.